They called him Isaiah Cole, the quiet blacksmith who forged every chain that bound his people. Day after day, he stood in the heat of the furnace, shaping iron for a man who called himself Master. Silas Thornton, the kind of man who believed fire itself, obeyed him. But when Silas struck Isaiah's son and left the boy bleeding on the foundry floor, something inside the blacksmith broke. The fire that once obeyed him turned against its master. And before the workers' eyes, Isaiah lifted a crucible of molten iron and poured it over Silas's head. They said the flames that night burned hotter than any furnace before it, hot enough to melt a man's sins into legend. But that was only the beginning, because what Isaiah did next would divide the South between fear and freedom. He forged their chains, the voice whispers, then used the same fire to break them. So tell me, was Isaiah Cole a monster, or the only honest man left in hell? Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The darkness broke slowly over Thornton Iron Works, reluctant as always. Isaiah Cole stood before the main furnace, watching orange light paint shadows across the brick floor. Sweat already beaded on his forehead, though the sun hadn't cleared the trees. The heat never left this place. Not in summer, not in winter. The fires burned constant, hungry, waiting. He wiped his brow with a rag that had turned gray from years of soot. His hands were thick and scarred, the kind of hands that told stories without words. Every callus, every burn mark, every line carved into his palms spoke of metal and flame. He was 38 years old. Some mornings he felt ancient. The furnace groaned behind him, a deep sound like something alive and breathing. Isaiah knew every sound it made. He understood its moods better than most men understood their own wives. When the iron was ready, when it needed more coal, when the temperature climbed too high and threatened to crack the brickwork. This knowledge kept him valuable. This knowledge kept him alive. The morning bell clanged across the foundry yard. Its harsh voice scattered birds from the rafters and brought men stumbling from their quarters. Isaiah turned from the furnace and began preparing his tools: hammer, tongs, the long iron rod he used for stirring the molten metal. Everything in its place. Everything ready. Footsteps pounded across the wooden walkway above. Too fast, too careless. Isaiah looked up and saw his son Caleb rushing down the stairs, nearly tripping over his own feet. The boy's shirt was half-tucked, his hair wild from sleep. 17 years old and still running late like a child. Caleb stumbled over a pile of cinders near the bottom step. His foot caught, and he went down hard on one knee. The sound echoed through the foundry. Isaiah's stomach tightened. He moved quickly, placing himself between his son and the doorway where Overseer Pike would enter. "Get up," Isaiah said quietly. "Brush yourself off." Caleb scrambled to his feet, wincing. His knee was bleeding through his trousers. He started to speak, but Isaiah cut him off with a look. Not now. Not here. The door swung open. Thomas Pike stepped into the foundry, his face already twisted with irritation. He was a thin man, all sharp angles and harder edges. His eyes swept the room like a hawk looking for prey. "Everyone present?" Pike demanded. "Yes, sir," Isaiah said. His voice was calm, level, the voice he used to keep trouble away. "All accounted for." Pike's gaze lingered on Caleb, taking in the boy's disheveled appearance and the dirt on his trousers. Isaiah felt his jaw tighten but kept his expression blank. Pike enjoyed finding fault. He fed on it. "You look like you've been rolling in the mud, boy," Pike said. "No, sir," Caleb answered. "Just hurrying to work, sir." Pike stepped closer. He was shorter than Caleb, but held himself like a man twice his size. "Hurrying? That what you call being late?" "He ain't late," Isaiah said. "Bell just rung. He's here on time." Pike turned slowly to face Isaiah. The overseer's hand rested on the whip at his belt, fingers drumming against the leather handle. "I don't recall asking you nothing." Isaiah said nothing. He met Pike's eyes for exactly 2 seconds, then looked down at the floor, long enough to show he wasn't afraid, short enough not to challenge. It was a careful balance, one he'd learned over many years. Pike snorted and walked away, muttering about mouthy workers. Isaiah waited until the overseer was gone before allowing himself to breathe. Caleb started to thank him, but Isaiah shook his head. "Get to the bellows. We got orders to fill." The morning dragged like molten iron being pulled into wire. The heat climbed as the sun rose higher. Isaiah worked steadily, hammering out shackles and wagon rims for the Confederate market. Each strike of his hammer was precise, measured. He wasted no motion, no energy. Efficiency kept the overseers satisfied. It kept their attention elsewhere. Caleb pumped the bellows, keeping the furnace hot. The boy's face was red and streaming with sweat. Between blasts of air, he watched his father work with something like wonder in his eyes. "Papa," Caleb said during a brief pause, "why you keep teaching me all the metalwork, the forging? What's the point when we can't never leave this place?" Isaiah didn't stop hammering. The rhythm never broke. Strike, turn, strike, turn. Red metal glowed under his hand, slowly taking the shape of another shackle. The irony wasn't lost on him. He forged the very chains that bound his people. A man who shapes iron shapes his fate. Isaiah said finally. "That don't make no sense," Caleb protested. "We don't have no fate except what Master Thornton decides." Isaiah plunged the half-finished shackle into the water barrel. Steam exploded upward, hissing and angry. When it cleared, he looked at his son. "Knowledge is the only thing they can't take from you," Isaiah said. "They can sell you, beat you, work you till you drop, but what's in your head? That's yours. You understand me?" Caleb nodded slowly, though Isaiah could see the doubt in the boy's eyes. The young still believed in freedom as something possible, something that might arrive like spring after a hard winter. Isaiah knew better. He'd stopped believing in easy freedom years ago. The foundry door opened again, bringing afternoon light and voices. Important voices. Isaiah recognized Silas Thornton's booming laugh before he saw the man. The master had arrived with guests. The darkness before dawn felt thicker than usual. Isaiah woke without needing light, his body trained to rise before the bell. Beside him in the cramped cabin, Caleb stirred and sat up, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Neither spoke. There was nothing to say at this hour. They dressed quickly and stepped outside where frost clung to the ground despite the coming spring. The walk to the foundry took them past rows of identical cabins, all dark and silent. Their breath came out in white clouds. Isaiah's boots crunched on frozen dirt, while Caleb matched his pace, step for step. The boy had grown tall this past year, nearly matching his father's height. But he still had that softness around his eyes, that gentleness that made Isaiah's chest ache with protective fear. The foundry loomed ahead, its chimneys already breathing smoke into the gray sky. Someone had stoked the fires early. Isaiah wondered who. Then he saw Thomas Pike standing by the main entrance, his lantern swinging as he paced back and forth. The overseer's presence before sunrise meant trouble. "Move faster," Pike barked as they approached. "Master wants everything perfect today. Everything." Inside, the heat hit them like a wall. The furnaces blazed at full strength, casting dancing shadows across brick and iron. Other workers were already arriving, shuffling into their positions with the weary movements of men who'd done this for years. Isaiah took his place at the main anvil. Caleb went to the bellows. Pike walked among them, his boots clicking on the stone floor. He carried a short wooden rod that he slapped against his palm as he moved. The sound made everyone flinch. "Line up," Pike ordered. "All of you, against that wall." They obeyed. Isaiah stood shoulder to shoulder with 15 other men, their faces illuminated by forge light. He could smell their fierce sweat mixing with coal dust and metal. Pike walked down the line slowly, examining each man like livestock at auction. "Master Thornton's bringing important people today," Pike said. "Investors from Richmond. Maybe from up north, too. You're going to show them how efficient this operation runs, how well-trained you all are." He stopped in front of a young man named Jacob, barely 16 years old. "That means no mistakes. You understand?" "Yes, sir," they answered together. Pike seemed satisfied. He dismissed them back to work, but kept watching, his eyes never resting. Isaiah returned to his anvil and began sorting tools. Everything had to be in perfect order. Perfect placement. No room for error. The sun climbed higher. The foundry grew hotter. Sweat soaked through Isaiah's shirt and dripped onto the floor where it sizzled and vanished. He worked mechanically, his hands moving through familiar motions while his mind stayed alert. Something was coming. He could feel it, the way animals sense storms. At mid-morning, the doors opened wide. Silas Thornton entered wearing a white suit so clean it seemed to glow against the foundry's darkness. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and thick-waisted, with gray hair slicked back from his forehead. His boots were polished to a mirror shine. He moved through the space like he owned everything he touched, because he did. "Gentlemen," Silas announced to no one in particular, "we have a few hours before our guests arrive. I want every crucible inspected, every mold checked, every tool counted and cleaned." His eyes swept across the workers. "Isaiah, come here." Isaiah set down his hammer and walked over. He kept his gaze lowered, his shoulders slightly bent, the posture of submission that white men expected. "Yes, Master Thornton." Silas circled him slowly. "You're my best smith. You know that, don't you?" "I do my work, sir." "More than that. You do excellent work. Work that keeps this foundry profitable." Silas paused. "That's why today's demonstration is so important. These investors need to see what makes Thornton Ironworks superior. They need to see discipline, efficiency, order." He leaned closer. "They need to see that my property understands its place." The words hung in the hot air. Isaiah said nothing. His jaw ached from clenching his teeth, but he kept his face neutral. "Make sure everyone performs perfectly," Silas continued. "Any mistakes reflect on you. Understood?" "Yes, sir." Silas dismissed him with a wave. Isaiah returned to his station, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up his hammer. Caleb caught his eye from across the room, his expression worried. Isaiah gave a tiny shake of his head. "Not now." The afternoon arrived with a clatter of carriage wheels. Well-dressed men in dark suits filed into the foundry, fanning themselves against the heat. They wore expressions of fascinated disgust, like visitors to a zoo observing dangerous animals. Silas led them through the space, pointing out features and explaining processes. "And here we have the main smelting operation," Silas said grandly. "Watch how efficiently these men work. Years of training have made them absolute masters of their craft." He gestured to Isaiah. "Show them the shackle-making process, from raw iron to finished product." Isaiah nodded and began. He pulled a rod of iron from the furnace using long tongs, its tip glowing white-hot. The investors stepped back from the heat. He placed the metal on the anvil and began hammering, shaping it with precise strikes. The rhythm was steady, hypnotic. Strike, turn, strike, turn. Young Jacob stood nearby, holding the mold that would form the shackle's curve. The boy's hands shook slightly. Isaiah noticed but couldn't stop mid-demonstration. He worked the iron through several heating cycles, gradually forming the U-shape. "Now, watch the molding process," Silas announced. Isaiah lifted the glowing iron and moved toward the mold. Jacob positioned it carefully. But the boy's nervous hands shifted at the wrong moment. The hot iron touched the mold's edge unevenly. There was a faint warping sound, barely audible, but unmistakable to trained ears. Silas heard it. The master's face darkened. He strode forward and snatched the mold from Jacob's hands. The warped edge was visible, a slight bubble in the metal that would make the shackle imperfect. "What is this?" Silas demanded. "I'm sorry, sir," Jacob stammered. "I didn't mean—" "Quiet." Silas turned to the investors. "Gentlemen, you see here the importance of discipline. When supervision fails, standards slip." He looked directly at Isaiah. "Your apprentice ruined a perfectly good mold." Isaiah's throat tightened. "Sir, the boy just needs more." "I didn't ask for excuses." Silas handed the mold to Pike. "Bring me a branding iron." "The small one." The foundry went silent. Even the fire seemed to quiet. Jacob's eyes went wide with understanding and terror. He started backing away, but Pike grabbed his arm. "No, please," Jacob whispered. Silas took the branding iron from Pike, a small implement used for marking tools and inventory. He thrust it into the furnace coals and waited while it heated. The investors watched with mixture of shock and morbid fascination. "Discipline," Silas said calmly, "is the foundation of efficiency. When standards slip, correction must be swift and memorable." He pulled the iron from the coals, its tip glowing red. "A mark of obedience, gentlemen." So he remembers his place. 2 days passed like fever dreams. Jacob's shoulder bore an angry red brand in the shape of Thornton's mark, a stylized T that would scar permanently. The boy worked through tears, unable to lift his left arm properly. Isaiah tended the wound each night with what little grease they could spare. But infection had already begun setting in. The edges of the burn wept clear fluid that stained Jacob's shirt. During those 2 days, Silas walked taller. He'd proven something to his investors, shown them the iron fist inside his velvet glove. Orders came flooding in. More shackles, more wagon parts, more bullets for the Confederate arsenals. The foundry roared day and night, and Isaiah worked until his vision blurred. Caleb watched his father with growing concern. Isaiah had stopped speaking, except when necessary. He ate without tasting, slept without dreaming. His eyes held something new, something that made even the other workers give him wider berth. When their hands touched while passing tools, Caleb felt how cold his father's skin had become despite the forge's heat. On the 3rd morning, Pike ordered Caleb to work directly with Isaiah on the largest iron pour of the season. A massive crucible needed filling, and the molten metal would be distributed into dozens of molds for military-grade shackles. The order came straight from Richmond. Confederate money meant Confederate priorities. By midday, the forge burned at peak temperature. The main crucible glowed like a captured sun, radiating heat that made breathing difficult. Isaiah stood beside it, tongs in hand, while Caleb waited nearby with a smaller carrying crucible. This was delicate work, dangerous work, the kind that required absolute focus and steady hands. Silas arrived in his shirt sleeves, having discarded his jacket in deference to the heat, but he still wore his expensive vest and gold watch chain, still maintained that air of untouchable superiority. He paced near the crucible, checking his pocket watch repeatedly. "We're behind schedule," he announced. "The Richmond shipment leaves tomorrow morning, and we're still 12 molds short." He glared at Isaiah. "I thought you said you could manage this." "We'll finish, sir," Isaiah replied, his voice flat. "You better." "Every delayed mold costs me money." Silas continued pacing, his boots clicking against stone. "Start pouring. Now!" Isaiah signaled to Caleb. The boy lifted the smaller crucible, already half filled with molten iron from an earlier pour. It weighed perhaps 30 pounds, manageable for a strong teenager but requiring careful balance. Caleb moved toward the waiting molds, his face tight with concentration. "Faster!" Silas snapped. "You're moving like you're carrying eggs." Caleb tried to quicken his pace. but the crucible's weight shifted unexpectedly. For just a moment, the molten surface tilted toward the edge. Caleb froze, his arms trembling with effort as he fought to stabilize it. "What are you doing?" Silas demanded. "Keep moving." "Sir, I don't want excuses. I want work done." Silas stepped closer, his face reddening. "You're hesitating because you're lazy. Your father's coddled you too much, made you soft." Caleb's arms shook harder. The crucible tilted further. A single drop of molten iron fell free and splashed onto the stone floor, where it hissed and cooled instantly. Then another drop. Then a thin stream. "You clumsy fool!" Silas roared. The stream of metal pooled on the floor, creating a small, glowing puddle. Caleb tried stepping backward, but his foot slipped on loose cinders. More iron poured out, spattering across the stones. The boy fought to regain balance, his young face twisted with panic. Silas's hand shot out and grabbed a nearby iron rod, one of the long pokers used for adjusting furnace coals. It was perhaps 4 feet long, solid metal, heavy enough to crack bone. "I'll teach you about wasting my property," Silas snarled. He swung the rod in a wide arc. It connected with the back of Caleb's head, with a sound like splitting wood. The impact drove the boy forward. The crucible flew from his hands and shattered against the floor, sending molten iron spraying in bright arcs. Caleb collapsed face first onto the stones, his body limp and unmoving. Smoke rose from his hair, where the rod's heated metal had touched him. A thin trickle of blood began pooling beneath his head. Isaiah dropped his tongs. They clattered against the anvil and fell silent. He stared at his son's motionless form. Everything else disappeared. The forge's roar, the workers' gasps, the hiss of cooling metal. Only Caleb existed in that moment. Only his boy, lying so still. "Lazy stock," Silas muttered, tossing the rod aside. "Can't even carry a simple crucible without—" Isaiah moved. His body acted before his mind caught up. Years of restraint, of swallowed anger, of buried rage, all of it shattered like ice under spring sun. He crossed the space between himself and the main crucible in 3 long strides. His hands closed around the handles, barely feeling the heat that blistered his palms. Something primal had awakened, something that lived below thought, below words, below everything civilized men pretended they were. It spoke in the language of fire and iron and blood. Silas was still talking, still ranting about laziness and waste and the cost of incompetence. He didn't see Isaiah lift the massive crucible, didn't notice when the big man turned toward him, the vessel held high. "Completely worthless, all of you. I should sell the lot and start fresh with—" Isaiah poured. The molten iron fell in a glowing arc, beautiful and terrible. It caught Silas across the crown of his head and shoulders, a waterfall of liquid metal at nearly 3,000 degrees. The iron hissed as it met flesh. Steam rose in white clouds. The smell hit immediately. Burning hair, cooking meat, something sweet and sickening underneath. Silas's scream was inhuman. His whole body convulsed as the metal flowed across his scalp, down his neck, spreading across his expensive vest. The fabric ignited. His skin bubbled and blackened. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. His hands clawed at his face, peeling away strips of melted flesh. Workers screamed. Some fainted outright, crumpling to the floor. Others ran for the doors, stumbling over each other in their panic. Pike stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing silently like a landed fish. Silas thrashed. His feet kicked against the stone. One hand reached toward Isaiah, fingers curling and uncurling. Then he fell forward, his body hitting the ground with a wet thud. The iron had burned through to bone in places. His skull showed white through blackened meat. He twitched once, twice, then went still. The foundry fell silent except for the fire's eternal crackling. Isaiah set down the crucible with shaking hands. His palms were covered in blisters, but he felt nothing. He walked to where Caleb lay and dropped to his knees beside his son. Gently, so gently, he turned the boy over. Caleb's chest rose and fell. Still breathing, still alive. A knot the size of a hen's egg had formed on the back of his head, and blood matted his hair, but his eyes flickered beneath closed lids. Isaiah's hands trembled as they touched his son's face. Tears fell freely now, cutting clean tracks through the soot on his cheeks. Behind him, Silas's body lay smoking. The smell of burned flesh filled the air. The forge light reflected in the puddles of cooling iron, creating dancing patterns across the floor. Isaiah looked at his burned hands, then at his unconscious son, then at the body of his master. His voice came out broken, barely above a whisper. He can't hurt anyone now. Smoke drifted through the foundry in gray curtains. The fire crackled and popped, indifferent to human suffering. In Isaiah's tear-filled eyes, the flames reflected like judgment, like prophecy, like the end of everything he'd known, and the terrible beginning of something else entirely. By dusk, news of Silas Thornton's death had spread through the plantation like wildfire. Field hands whispered in tight clusters. House servants kept their eyes down and moved quickly through their tasks. The air itself felt different, charged with something electric and dangerous. Fear mixed with something else, something the enslaved workers had learned to bury deep, but never quite forgotten. The foundry stood empty, except for the body. Someone had draped a white sheet over what remained of Silas Thornton. Already, dark stains seeped through the fabric where the metal had burned deepest. The forge still burned low, its coals glowing sullen red in the gathering darkness. No one had dared enter to tend it properly. Isaiah sat in chains in the basement below. They had come for him within the hour. Pike and 3 other overseers, all carrying rifles, all keeping their distance as if rage might be contagious. They dragged him down the narrow stairs to the storage cellar beneath the foundry, a cramped space lined with iron scraps and broken tools. Heavy shackles circled his wrists and ankles, connected by chains to an iron ring bolted into the stone wall. His hands throbbed where the crucible's heat had blistered his palms. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain up his arms, but he barely noticed. His mind stayed fixed on one image, Caleb's unconscious face, the blood in his hair, the shallow rise and fall of his chest. They had taken his son to the slave quarters. That was all Pike would tell him before slamming the cellar door shut. Upstairs, in the main house, Margaret Thornton stood in her late husband's study and listened to Pike make his case for immediate execution. "We have to hang him tonight," Pike insisted, his voice tight and urgent, "before the others get ideas, before they think they can do the same and get away with it." Margaret sat behind the heavy oak desk, her hands folded in her lap. She was 32 years old, dark-haired, with sharp features and sharper eyes. Unlike many plantation wives, she had always understood the business side of her husband's empire. Silas had consulted her on contracts, on pricing, on which investments to pursue. She knew every ledger, every debt, every promise made to buyers in Richmond and Atlanta and Charleston. She also knew they were in deeper trouble than Pike realized. "You want to make a spectacle," she said quietly. "String him up in front of everyone as a warning." "Exactly." Pike paced before the desk, his boots clicking against hardwood. "We show them what happens when they step out of line. We remind them who's in charge here. And what message does that send to our buyers?" Margaret's voice remained calm, almost gentle. "The Confederate quartermaster's office is expecting 1,200 pounds of finished ironwork by week's end. The contract is worth $8,000. How do we deliver that product without our master blacksmith?" Pike stopped pacing. "We have other smiths, none with Isaiah's skill." She opened a ledger on the desk, running her finger down a column of numbers. He completes work in half the time of anyone else. His pieces never fail inspection. The military buyers specifically requested his craftsmanship for the shackle order. She looked up, meeting Pike's eyes. We need him alive if we want to keep this foundry running. But the others will see weakness. The others will see that I make decisions based on profit, not emotion. Margaret closed the ledger with a soft thud. This was an accident. A moment of uncontrolled rage brought on by a father watching his son nearly killed. I will handle it privately. Isaiah will be punished, but he will continue to work. Pike's jaw tightened. Mrs. Thornton, with respect. This discussion is finished. Her voice hardened just slightly, enough to make Pike flinch. Return to your duties. Make sure the field hands stay in their quarters tonight. I'll deal with Isaiah myself. Pike wanted to argue. Margaret could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. But he was an overseer, not family, and she had just reminded him of that fact. He gave a curt nod and left the study, closing the door harder than necessary. Margaret sat alone in the lamplight for several minutes. Then she stood, gathered a lamp and a small cloth bundle, and walked out through the back of the house toward the foundry. The basement door required 2 keys. She unlocked it and descended the narrow stairs, her skirts whispering against stone. The smell hit her first. Sweat and blood and burned flesh still clinging to the air from above. Then she saw him. Isaiah sat against the far wall, chains pooling around his feet. His head was bowed, his burned hands resting palms up on his thighs. He didn't look up when she entered. Margaret set the lamp on a barrel and unwrapped the cloth bundle. Inside was half a loaf of bread, some dried meat, and a small jar of water. She placed these items on the ground within his reach. Your son is alive, she said. Unconscious still, but breathing. The doctor says he'll likely wake by morning. Isaiah's head lifted slowly. His eyes were red-rimmed, hollowed out by grief and shock. He stared at her without speaking. I'm not going to hang you, Margaret continued. Pike wants me to. Half the county will expect it, but I have other plans. What plans? His voice came out rough, barely more than a rasp. Margaret pulled a small crate closer and sat down, arranging her skirts carefully. My husband left several unfinished contracts. The most important is with the Confederate quartermaster. Military-grade ironwork worth $8,000. But there are others. Northern buyers, secretly purchasing through intermediaries. Abolition societies willing to pay premium prices for weapons they claim are for defensive purposes. She paused, watching his face. I intend to fulfill all these contracts. Both sides will pay, and pay well. Isaiah said nothing. You're going to help me do it, Margaret said. You're going to continue working the forge, training the other smiths, completing every order that comes through these doors, and in return, I will spare your life. More than that, I will personally ensure Caleb receives medical care and lighter work duties during his recovery. You want me to forge weapons, Isaiah said slowly, for the same people who keep us in chains. I want you to survive. Margaret leaned forward slightly. This war that's coming, and it is coming, make no mistake, will destroy the old order. When it does, those with money and connections will determine what rises in its place. I intend to be one of those people. And I intend to use that position to do what my husband never would. Buy freedom for slaves who prove their value. Isaiah stared at her. You're asking me to trust you. I'm asking you to be practical. She stood, smoothing her skirts. You killed my husband. Under any normal circumstance, you would already be dead. But I am offering you a chance, not just at survival, but at eventual freedom for yourself and your son. All you have to do is work. Use those skilled hands to forge the future I'm describing. She moved toward the stairs, then paused with one hand on the railing. Think it over tonight, she said. Tomorrow morning, I'll return for your answer. But understand this, Isaiah. If you refuse, Pike gets his way. And your son grows up without a father, assuming he grows up at all. The lamp cast her shadow long against the wall. Then she climbed the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the narrow space. The door closed. The lock turned with a heavy click. Isaiah sat in the half-darkness, staring at the bread she'd left. His burned hands trembled. Upstairs, somewhere above him, his son lay unconscious. Around him, chains rattled softly with each breath. He picked up the bread and tore off a small piece. It was still warm, fresh from the kitchen. He chewed slowly, tasting nothing. His voice came out as barely a whisper, speaking to the empty cellar, to the ghosts of his choices, to whatever God might still be listening. I traded one chain for another. The eastern sky had barely begun to pale when Pike unlocked the cellar door. Isaiah heard the key turn, then the creak of rusted hinges, then Pike's boots descending one step at a time. "Get up," Pike said. "Mrs. Thornton wants you in the forge." Isaiah rose slowly, chains scraping against stone. His burned palms had scabbed over during the night, the skin tight and angry-looking. Every flex of his fingers sent sharp pains shooting up his forearms. Pike unlocked the shackles from the wall, but left the irons on Isaiah's wrists. They walked through the pre-dawn darkness toward the foundry. Isaiah could see other workers gathering near the main building, their faces turned toward him with expressions he couldn't quite read. Fear, maybe, or something closer to awe. He kept his eyes forward. The foundry doors stood open. Inside, the furnaces were already burning, tended by two of the younger smiths. Margaret Thornton waited near the main anvil, dressed in black mourning clothes, a ledger tucked under one arm. "Mr. Pike will remain nearby," she said, without preamble. "You'll work under his supervision until I'm satisfied you pose no further threat. The others will continue their usual duties. You'll focus on the military contracts." She opened the ledger, showing him a detailed list of items. 60 musket barrels by week's end, 24 bayonet fittings, and these. She pointed to a separate column. Chain assemblies for the prison wagons. Standard gauge, reinforced links. Isaiah looked at the list, then at her. "My son," he said, "is resting in the quarters." Margaret closed the ledger. "The doctor examined him this morning. He's conscious now, though weak. If you fulfill today's quota, I'll allow him to sit in the shade near the foundry tomorrow. He can assist with small tasks as his strength returns." She left without waiting for a response. Pike positioned himself on a barrel near the door, rifle across his knees, and settled in to watch. Isaiah moved to his station. The tools felt foreign in his damaged hands, the hammer too heavy, the tongs awkward to grip. But muscle memory took over. He selected iron stock from the pile, checked the furnace temperature, and began. The first hammer strike rang out across the foundry like a bell. The sound carried. Workers in the fields lifted their heads. Those in the main house paused in their tasks. Even the guards seemed to take notice. The rhythm of Isaiah's work announcing that something had shifted, that the natural order had bent but not broken. Pike watched from his barrel, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. After an hour, he called out loud enough for everyone to hear. "Look at him," Pike said, his voice carrying a mocking edge. "The devil's own blacksmith. Killed a man with fire and now he's back making chains. Ain't that something?" No one responded. The other smiths kept their eyes on their work. But Isaiah noticed how they moved, keeping greater distance from him than before, handling their tools with extra care, as if the violence might be contagious. By midday, Caleb appeared at the foundry entrance. He walked slowly, one hand pressed to his head where the wound had been bandaged. Pike gestured toward a shaded area near the water barrel. "Boy can sit there," Pike said. "Don't expect no special treatment." Caleb lowered himself carefully onto a wooden crate. His eyes found his father across the forge, and something passed between them. Not words, but understanding. Isaiah returned to his work, but his hammering took on a different quality, more focused, more deliberate. That evening, as the sun touched the horizon, Margaret returned. She carried rolled blueprints under her arm and a small leather case. Pike stood and tipped his hat as she approached. "Leave us," she told him. Pike hesitated, glancing at Isaiah. "Ma'am, I don't think—" "I said leave us, Mr. Pike. Wait outside." He went, though his displeasure showed in every movement. Margaret spread the blueprints across the main workbench, weighing down the corners with chunks of scrap iron. "These are the specifications for the northern buyers," she said. "Rifle components, primarily. They'll pay 3 times what the Confederates offer, but they require absolute discretion. No marks, no identifying features that could trace the work back to this foundry." Isaiah studied the drawings. Advanced designs, more sophisticated than the standard Confederate weapons. "You're selling to both sides," he said. "I'm ensuring this estate survives the coming conflict." Margaret's finger traced one of the blueprints. "The South will lose this war, Isaiah. Perhaps not this year or next, but eventually. And when it does, the old families, the ones who bet everything on slavery and cotton, they'll be ruined. But those who prepared, who built connections in both directions—" She looked up at him. "Those families will shape what comes after." "And the people you keep enslaved?" Isaiah asked. "What happens to them in this future you're building?" "The valuable ones will be freed, gradually, as the system allows." She rolled up the blueprints. "That's more than my husband would have offered. That's more than most people in this county would even consider." She left the blueprints on the bench. Before departing, she set down the leather case and opened it. Inside were precision tools, delicate files, measurement calipers, small etching implements. "You'll need these for the detail work," she said. Then she was gone. Isaiah stared at the case for a long moment. Then he looked at Caleb, still resting in the shade. His son's eyes were open, watching. That night, after the other workers had been dismissed to their quarters, Isaiah remained in the forge with Caleb. He banked the main furnace, but kept one small coal fire burning. From his apron pocket, he withdrew one of Margaret's precision files. "Come here," he told Caleb quietly. His son rose and moved to the workbench. Isaiah selected a half-finished shackle from the day's work, one of the prison wagon chains Margaret had ordered. He positioned it carefully and handed Caleb the file. "You see this spot here?" Isaiah pointed to a specific link. "File a notch, small, so small you can barely see it, right where the metal's thinnest." Caleb's hands shook slightly as he took the tool. "Father, if they find out—" "They won't. Not unless they know what to look for." Isaiah guided his son's hand, showing him the exact angle. "Every piece we make from now on gets a mark, a weakness they can't see, a flaw that'll give way when someone needs it to." "What kind of mark?" Isaiah took the file and made a tiny etching, a simple pattern that resembled a flame, no bigger than a grain of rice hidden in the metal's texture. "Our mark," he said. "So someday, someone will know we fought back the only way we could." They worked through the night, taking turns with the file. Each completed piece received the same treatment: a sabotaged link, a weakened bolt, a hidden fracture that would spread under strain. Small acts of rebellion forged into the very chains meant to bind. As dawn approached, Isaiah held one of the marked shackles up to the dying firelight. The tiny flame symbol caught the orange glow, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. His voice came out quiet, but steady. Let them wear their own undoing. Behind him, the furnace roared back to life as the new day began. A week later, Margaret appeared at the foundry entrance carrying a wicker basket covered with white cloth. Pike started to rise from his usual post, but she waved him back down. The afternoon sun slanted through the open doors, catching the iron dust that floated in the air like ash. Isaiah set down his hammer. He'd been working on musket components all morning, his hands moving with the mechanical precision Margaret required. Sweat ran down his bare chest in dark rivulets, leaving trails through the soot that covered his skin. "Walk with me," Margaret said. It wasn't a request. Isaiah wiped his hands on his apron and followed her outside. They moved away from the foundry, toward a grove of oak trees that marked the edge of the workyard. The shade brought little relief from the August heat. Margaret set the basket down and pulled back the cloth. Bread, cheese, cold chicken. Real food, not the cornmeal mush and salt pork the workers normally received. She gestured for him to eat. Isaiah remained standing. "What do you want?" "To discuss our arrangement." She produced a folded document from her sleeve. "The northern buyers I mentioned, they've agreed to my terms. $3,000 for the completed shipment, paid in Boston bank notes, untraceable. And you trust them? They're abolitionists, Isaiah. Quakers, mostly. They oppose slavery on moral grounds, but they're also pragmatists. They understand that winning this coming war will require weapons." She smoothed the document against her skirt. "They've asked about the workers here, about conditions, treatment. They specifically inquired about you." Isaiah's expression didn't change. "What did you tell them?" "That you're the finest blacksmith in Virginia. That my late husband recognized your talent even if he couldn't properly value it." She paused. "They've proposed something. A gesture of good faith to prove my stated intentions are genuine." She held out the document. Isaiah took it slowly, his scarred fingers leaving smudges on the paper. The words swam before his eyes. He could read simple letters, words Caleb had taught him, but legal language remained mostly incomprehensible. "It's a manumission paper," Margaret said. "For your son. I'm prepared to sign it today, in front of witnesses. Caleb will be legally free." The document trembled in Isaiah's grip. He looked up at her, searching her face for the trap he knew must be hidden somewhere in this offer. "Why?" "Because the northern buyers want proof that I'm different from my husband, that I'm willing to act on principle, not just profit." She produced a pen and small ink bottle from her basket. "And because you've fulfilled every requirement I've set. Your work has been exemplary. You've caused no trouble, no disruption to operations." Isaiah stared at the paper. Freedom. The word tasted strange even in his mind, like something from another language. "What's the cost?" he asked. "Your continued cooperation. One final shipment, 200 rifle barrels, hardware for artillery carriages, specialized components the buyers have specifically requested. 4 months' work, perhaps 5. She met his eyes directly. "Complete it to their satisfaction, and I'll sign your papers too. Freedom given can be taken again," Isaiah said quietly. "Not legal manumission, not in writing, with proper witnesses." Margaret took the document back and spread it against a flat stone, dipping the pen in ink. Her signature flowed across the bottom in elegant script. "I'm not my husband, Isaiah. I don't believe God intended one race to serve another in perpetuity, but I also understand that change takes time. Systems must shift gradually, or they collapse entirely." She rolled the document carefully and handed it back to him. "Caleb will move to the small cabin behind the main house. He'll work as a messenger, running errands between the foundry and the business office. Paid work, 50 cents a week, plus board. In 6 months, he can save enough to leave Virginia entirely, if he chooses." Isaiah couldn't speak. He looked down at the rolled paper in his hands, at the official seal pressed into the wax, at Margaret's signature declaring his son a free person under Virginia law. "There's something else," Margaret said. She reached into her basket again and withdrew a small wooden box. "Medicine, quinine, laudanum, bandages. I'm donating it to the workers' quarters. Dr. Ashford will make rounds twice weekly instead of monthly." "Why are you doing this?" "Because I can afford to be merciful now that I'm no longer married to a man who saw cruelty as proof of strength. She closed the basket. And because the world is changing, Isaiah, the old ways are dying. I intend to be on the right side of history when it finally ends. That evening, Caleb moved his few possessions to the cabin Margaret had designated. Isaiah helped him carry a thin mattress and 2 blankets across the yard. The cabin was small but sturdy, with a real door that closed and a window with glass panes. Caleb stood in the doorway, looking back toward the workers' quarters where he'd spent his entire life. "It doesn't feel real," he said. "It's real enough." Isaiah set the blankets on the narrow bed. "But don't forget where you came from. Don't forget the people still living in those quarters." They walked to the river as the sun set, following a path that wound through the trees. The water ran slow and dark, reflecting the first stars. Caleb sat on a fallen log, while Isaiah stood at the water's edge. "Maybe not all white folks are the same," Caleb said, after a long silence. "Maybe some of them really do want things to change." Isaiah didn't answer. He stared at his reflection in the black water, a dark shape against darker depths, features obscured by the failing light. His own face looked like a stranger's. Around them, crickets began their evening song. A fish jumped somewhere downstream, the splash barely audible. The foundry's glow painted the distant sky orange. Isaiah knelt and touched the water, watching his reflection fragment and reform. When he stood again, his hands were dripping, and the reflection had disappeared entirely into darkness. They walked back together through the gathering night. The cabin's window showed a small light, the candle Margaret had left for Caleb. Isaiah stopped at the edge of the yard. "Sleep well," he told his son. "You too, father." But Isaiah didn't return to the workers' quarters immediately. He stood in the darkness between the cabin and the foundry, looking at both structures, calculating distances and angles he couldn't quite name. The manumission paper rested against his chest, tucked into his shirt for safekeeping. Above him, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small transactions of freedom and bondage playing out below. A dog barked somewhere on the plantation. A door closed, the normal sounds of evening settling into night. The next morning dawned clear and quiet. No unusual activity disturbed the plantation's routine. Workers filed to their assignments. The foundry fires were lit. Margaret reviewed her ledgers in the main house. Isaiah returned to his station and picked up his hammer, beginning another day's work on the northern shipment that would supposedly purchase his freedom. Everything appeared exactly as it should be. 3 nights later, Isaiah woke to shouting. The sound cut through the heavy August air, sharp and angry. Male and female voices clashing somewhere beyond the workers' quarters. Isaiah sat up on his thin mattress, listening. Most of the other men remained asleep, exhausted from 14-hour shifts at the forge. Isaiah pulled on his shirt and moved to the door. The shouting came from the direction of the overseer's quarters, a small house halfway between the main plantation and the foundry. Light showed through the windows. Shadows moved inside. He shouldn't go. Every instinct warned him to stay in his bunk, to mind his own business, to remember that curiosity among the enslaved often ended badly. But something in those raised voices pulled at him. A tension that felt important, dangerous. Isaiah slipped outside and moved through the darkness. The moon hung thin and pale, offering little light. He knew these paths by heart, had walked them hundreds of times. His bare feet made no sound on the packed earth. As he drew closer to the overseer's quarters, the voices became clearer. Pike's voice, tight with anger. Margaret's voice, cold and controlled. Isaiah crouched behind a stack of empty barrels near the window, pressing himself into shadow. "Lying to me from the start," Pike was saying. "I found the ledgers, the real ones, not the doctored books you showed the investors. Those are private business records." Margaret's tone remained steady. "You had no authority to search my office. I had every right to know what's happening on this plantation. You're selling to both sides, Margaret. Confederate buyers in Richmond and Northern buyers in Boston. The same weapons, the same materials, double profit. Pike's shadow moved across the window. You're playing them against each other. A long silence followed. Isaiah held his breath, straining to hear. And what of it? Margaret said finally. The war is coming whether we profit from it or not. Why shouldn't I secure my future before everything collapses? You told me, you told everyone, that you were different from Silas, that you wanted to help them. Pike's voice dropped lower. You freed that boy. You promised to free his father. Was any of it real? Of course it was real. The manumission papers are legal and binding. Caleb is genuinely free. She paused. But freedom costs money, Thomas. My late husband left debts I'm still discovering. The plantation is mortgaged beyond its value. Without substantial capital, I'll lose everything, including the ability to free anyone at all. So you're arming both the slavers and the abolitionists? Pike laughed, a bitter sound. That's not business. That's treason against both sides. It's survival. Margaret's shadow moved to a cabinet. Glass clinked. She was pouring something. The North will win eventually. Their industry, their population, their moral certainty. It's inevitable. But the South has money now, today, and I need that money to secure passage to Europe before the fighting starts. Once I'm established in London or Paris, I can support abolitionist causes from safety, while the people here burn. The people here will burn regardless of what I do. Her voice hardened. I didn't create this system, Thomas. I'm simply extracting myself from it before it destroys me too. Isaiah's hands clenched against the barrel. His breathing came shallow and quick. Everything she'd told him, the Northern buyers' moral concerns, the promises of gradual freedom, the medicine and better conditions, all of it was theater. Performance designed to keep him working while she built her escape. Pike spoke again. I want a cut. 20% of whatever you're making from the Northern sales. Absolutely not. Then I'll expose you. I'll take those ledgers to the Confederate authorities and tell them you're selling secrets to the enemy. You'll do no such thing. Margaret's voice turned icy. Because I have detailed records of your theft from the plantation stores, 3 years of skimming supplies, selling them in town, pocketing the difference. Enough to have you hanged for stealing from a widow. Another silence. Isaiah could hear Pike breathing hard through the window. We're both trapped then, Pike said finally. We're both free, Margaret corrected, as long as we maintain our arrangement. You keep my secrets, I keep yours. The shipments continue. The money accumulates. And when the time comes, we both leave this God-forsaken place behind. Their voices faded as they moved deeper into the house. Isaiah remained behind the barrels, his mind racing. He needed to think, to process what he'd heard. But his thoughts kept fragmenting, returning to a single terrible realization. He'd been forging weapons for both sides of a coming war. Everything he'd made would be used to kill, to enslave, to perpetuate the exact suffering he'd hoped to escape. He waited until the light in the overseer's quarters went dark, then made his way back to the workers' quarters. But he didn't sleep. He lay on his mattress, staring at the ceiling, watching the darkness shift as dawn approached. The next morning, Isaiah went to find Caleb. The cabin behind the main house stood empty. The door hung open. Inside, Caleb's few possessions were gone. The blankets, the spare shirt, even the candle Margaret had provided. Only the bare mattress remained. Isaiah's chest tightened. He crossed the yard to the foundry, searching. Caleb wasn't at his usual station, wasn't anywhere in the workyard. Isaiah grabbed one of the other workers, a man named Samuel. Where's Caleb? Samuel wouldn't meet his eyes. Mrs. Thornton took him yesterday evening. Said he was going to Richmond on an errand. What kind of errand? Didn't say. Samuel pulled away. Pike was with them. Had a wagon loaded with crates. Isaiah released him and walked to the forge. The fires burned hot, waiting for the day's work to begin. He stood before them, feeling heat wash over his face and chest. His hands began to shake. He'd heard Margaret mention a shipment to Confederate buyers, missing inventory that needed to be covered up. And now, Caleb was gone, traveling with Pike and crates to Richmond. The realization hit him like a physical blow. She'd sent his son, his freed son, as part of the shipment. Probably listed him as property in the manifest, negating the manumission entirely, using him to balance her books, to explain away discrepancies in her double-dealing. Isaiah's legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees before the forge, hands pressed against the hot stones. A sound came from his throat, raw and animal. Around him, other workers stopped what they were doing, watching with frightened eyes. "I made the fire," Isaiah whispered. The words came out broken, barely coherent. "I made the fire, and now it's coming for all of us." He stayed there as the sun rose higher, as the foundry filled with workers, as the overseers shouted for the day's production to begin. The heat from the forge burned against his skin, but he didn't move, couldn't move. Finally, as the morning shift began in earnest, Isaiah stood. His face was wet. Sweat or tears, he couldn't tell which. He walked to his station with mechanical precision, picked up his hammer, and began working the metal that glowed orange in the crucible. That night, long after the other workers had gone to their quarters, Isaiah remained in the foundry. He sat before the dying embers, watching them pulse with fading heat. His hands were black with soot, his clothes stained with ash and sweat. The forge cast strange shadows on the walls. Tools hung from their hooks like instruments of judgment. The air smelled of coal and iron and something darker, the scent of broken promises. Isaiah reached out and touched the warm stones, feeling their heat seep into his scarred palms. His lips moved, forming words too quiet to hear. "If she'll sell her soul," he whispered, "I'll melt mine." The embers glowed faintly in response, a dull red heartbeat in the darkness. Isaiah sat unmoving, his eyes reflecting that dying light, his mind turning over possibilities that had no names yet. Around him, the foundry settled into silence. The night stretched long and deep, and somewhere in the darkness, something new was being forged. Something that had nothing to do with Margaret's ledgers or Pike's greed or the weapons that would arm a war. Something made of fire and grief and the terrible mathematics of revenge. The next evening, Isaiah stood at the edge of the foundry yard as twilight bled into darkness. The night shift was skeletal. Only a handful of workers remained to tend the banked fires, and the guards rotated in lazy patterns, their attention dulled by routine and cheap whiskey. He'd counted their movements for 3 nights running, knew exactly when they gathered near the tool shed to smoke, knew how long before they bothered checking the rear gates. He moved through the shadows, touching each worker on the shoulder as he passed, a gesture that meant follow. No words yet. Words could be overheard, twisted, used as evidence when the inevitable reckoning came. But touch, that was older than language, more primal than fear. They gathered in the smelting hall, 23 men and women whose names would never appear in any ledger that mattered. The furnaces glowed low, casting their faces in shades of bronze and shadow. Isaiah stood before them, his scarred hands hanging loose at his sides. "She lied to us," he said. His voice was quiet, but carried clearly in the cavernous space. Everything Margaret Thornton promised was theater, a performance to keep us working while she built herself an escape. He told them what he'd heard through the overseer's window, told them about the double dealing, the weapons sold to both armies, the ledgers that recorded their lives as inventory to be traded or discarded as profit demanded. Some of the workers began shaking their heads, backing toward the doors. Others stood frozen, their faces hardening with each revelation. "My son is gone," Isaiah continued. "She sent him to Richmond as part of a shipment to cover her missing inventory, took his freedom papers, and turned him back into property with a stroke of her pen." A woman named Ruth spoke up, her voice trembling. "What are we supposed to do? We can't fight them. They have guns, horses, the law itself." "We have fire," Isaiah said simply. Samuel, who'd worked beside Isaiah for 15 years, stepped forward. "You talking about running?" "Because they'll hunt us down in 3 days. String us up on every tree between here and the mountains." "I'm not talking about running." The words hung in the air like smoke. Understanding spread slowly across their faces, some horrified, others calculating, weighing survival against dignity in the scales of desperation. Jacob moved through the crowd. The brand on his shoulder was still healing, the flesh pink and puckered beneath his torn shirt. He was only 16, barely strong enough to lift the heavy hammers, but something had changed in him since Silas had marked him. The fear had burned away, leaving only a cold clarity. "If we die in the fire," Jacob said, his young voice carrying surprising weight, "we die as men, not property, not inventory in someone's ledger." He looked around at the others. "I'd rather burn than be sold again." Murmurs spread through the group, some nodding slowly, others still uncertain. Isaiah let them process it, let the idea take root in soil, fertilized by years of accumulated indignities. He knew better than to push. This decision had to be theirs, made freely, or it would collapse at the first sign of danger. A man named Thomas, different from Pike, older, with white in his beard, raised his hand. "How?" "They'll shoot us the moment we make a move." Isaiah had spent the day planning, had used his hours at the forge to think through every angle, every variable, every point where the plan could fracture. He explained it now, his voice methodical, almost calm. They would wait until the guards made their usual circuit to the tool shed. Block the foundry gates from the inside using the iron bars meant for wagon reinforcements. Flood the ventilation shafts with coal smoke to create confusion and cover. The overseers who remained inside, Pike and 3 others who supervised the night shift, would be trapped. Then they would stoke the furnaces to maximum heat and prepare the molten iron for one final demonstration of what fire could accomplish. "And after?" Ruth asked. "When it's done, what happens to us?" Isaiah met her eyes. "We scatter. Some north, some west. They can't hunt all of us if we split into small groups. Maybe some make it, maybe none do, but at least we choose our own ending." Silence fell over the smelting hall. The furnaces crackled softly. Outside, footsteps, the guards beginning their patrol toward the tool shed. Isaiah watched the workers' faces, seeing fear war with something else, something harder to name but impossible to mistake. One by one, they nodded. Isaiah moved quickly then, issuing instructions in whispers. Samuel and 3 others went to gather the iron bars from storage. Ruth and the women began filling buckets with coal dust to dump into the ventilation shafts. Jacob positioned himself near the main gates with the heavy timber brace that would seal them shut. The guards' voices drifted from the tool shed. Laughter, the clink of a bottle being passed. Pike's distinctive rasp cutting through the night air, complaining about Margaret's latest demands. They were relaxed, comfortable, certain in their authority. Isaiah watched through the window as they settled into their usual routine, counted heartbeats, waited for the precise moment when their attention would be most divided. "Now," he said quietly. Jacob and 2 others lifted the timber brace and slammed it into the iron brackets across the main gates. The sound echoed like thunder. Inside the foundry, Pike's head snapped up from where he'd been reviewing production logs near the smaller forge. His eyes widened as he saw the workers moving with sudden purpose, their usual shuffling deference replaced by something coordinated and deliberate. "What the hell?" he started. Samuel and his team dropped the iron bars across the rear exits, the metal ringing as it fell into place. Ruth climbed the ladder to the ventilation controls and began dumping coal dust into the shafts. Black smoke immediately started pouring through the foundry's interior, thick and choking. Pike drew his pistol, but his hand shook. "You're all dead. You hear me? Dead!" The three other overseers scrambled for weapons, but the smoke was spreading too fast, filling the air with caustic darkness. They stumbled toward the gates, found them barred, began hammering against the iron with their fists. Isaiah walked to the main furnace. The controls were simple, levers and chains that regulated airflow and fuel feed. He'd operated them 1,000 times, knew exactly how to coax maximum heat from the banked coals. He began pulling levers, opening vents, feeding the fire until it roared with renewed hunger. "Isaiah!" Pike shouted through the smoke. "Isaiah, listen to me! We can work this out!" Isaiah didn't answer. He moved to the crucibles, checking which ones held molten iron from the day's work. 2 were still liquid, glowing orange-white in their stone cradles. He positioned them near the main workspace, where Pike and the overseers were trying to break through the barred windows. Around him, the other workers moved with grim efficiency. Some gathered tools and supplies for the escape. Others helped maintain the fire, adding fuel, adjusting vents, turning the foundry into a roaring furnace. The heat became overwhelming, sweat pouring from their faces, but no one slowed. Pike's voice grew desperate. "Margaret will have you all hanged, every single one of you." "She already sold us," Isaiah said, loud enough to carry over the fire's roar. "What's left to hang?" He lifted the first crucible using the heavy tongs. The molten iron sloshed inside like liquid light. Through the smoke, he could see Pike's terrified face pressed against the window bars, see him finally understanding what was coming. Isaiah approached the window slowly, deliberately. Let Pike see exactly what he held. Let him feel the heat radiating from the crucible. Let him know, in his final moments, what it meant to be helpless before another man's judgment. "Please," Pike whispered. "Please, I was just following orders." "So was I," Isaiah said. He tilted the crucible. Outside, in the mansion's upper floor, Margaret Thornton woke to the sound of screaming. She rushed to her window and saw flames rising into the night sky. Great pillars of orange fire that turned the darkness into day. The foundry blazed like a torch, smoke pouring from every vent and window, and even from this distance she could hear the terrible sounds coming from inside. She stood frozen, her white nightgown billowing in the draft from the open window, watching her empire burn. Margaret's bare feet slapped against the gravel path as she ran. The heat reached her before she was halfway to the foundry, a wall of scorching air that made breathing difficult. Her white nightgown caught on thorns and tore, leaving streaks of blood along her calves. But she didn't slow. In her right hand she clutched her husband's old pistol, the one he'd kept in his desk drawer, loaded and ready for the slave rebellion he'd always feared would come. That rebellion was here now, and she'd brought it on herself. The foundry's main gates stood barred from inside. Iron reinforcements crossed like bones over a grave. Through the gaps, she could see figures moving through the smoke and fire. The enslaved workers she'd counted as assets in her ledgers, now transformed into something she barely recognized. Their faces were set with terrible purpose, moving with coordination that spoke of careful planning. She circled to the side entrance, the smaller door used for deliveries. It hung open, unguarded in the chaos. Heat poured from the opening like breath from a dragon's mouth. Margaret lifted her nightgown and stepped inside. The pistol raised, though her hands shook so badly she could barely aim. The interior was hell made manifest. Flames licked up the support beams. Smoke churned through the air in black waves. The furnaces roared at their maximum capacity, the sound like a perpetual scream. Through the haze, She saw the windows where Pike and the overseers had been, saw what remained of them, and her stomach turned. Isaiah stood before the main furnace, silhouetted against the fire. His shirt was gone, his skin slick with sweat and ash. He turned slowly as she entered, his expression empty of everything except exhaustion. "Stop this!" Margaret commanded, though her voice came out thin and desperate. "Stop it now, and I'll fix everything." Isaiah didn't move. Around them, the other workers had paused in their preparations for escape, watching the confrontation with wary eyes. "I can buy Caleb back," Margaret continued, taking a step closer. The heat was unbearable, like standing too near the sun. "I have connections in Richmond. I know the buyers. I'll get him back. Give him his freedom papers properly this time. Legal and binding. Where is he?" Isaiah's voice was hoarse from the smoke. Margaret hesitated. The truth sat heavy on her tongue, fighting against her instinct for self-preservation. But something in Isaiah's eyes told her that lies wouldn't save her now. Nothing would save her now. "I don't know," she admitted. "The shipment went through 3 different brokers. He could be anywhere between here and Charleston by now." She swallowed hard. He might already be. They don't always keep careful records when they move product quickly. Isaiah's shoulders sagged. He turned away from her, facing the furnace, and his whole body began to shake. Not with rage this time, with something worse, a grief so profound it seemed to hollow him out from the inside. He dropped to his knees, the hammer falling from his hand with a clang that echoed through the burning building. He wept silently. No sound escaped his throat, but his shoulders heaved with the force of it. Tears cut clean lines through the soot on his face, reflecting the firelight like molten metal themselves. Margaret saw her chance. The ledgers. She'd left them in the office, a small structure attached to the main foundry. If she could reach them, she could rebuild. The records contained everything. Names, prices, contracts, debts. With those, she could salvage her fortune, start again somewhere else. She moved toward the office door, trying to stay quiet, but the old floorboards creaked under her weight. Isaiah's head came up. He saw where she was going, what she intended, and rose smoothly to his feet, despite his grief. Margaret ran. She burst through the office door and grabbed the leather satchel containing 3 years of meticulous record-keeping. Every transaction, every sale, every piece of property, human and otherwise, that had passed through Thornton Ironworks. Her ticket to survival. She turned to find Isaiah blocking the doorway. "Please," she said. "Please. These are just papers. They don't matter anymore." "They're everything," Isaiah said quietly. "Every name in there is someone's child, someone's parent, someone reduced to numbers and prices." He stepped forward. "Including mine." Margaret backed away until she hit the wall. "You'll burn us all. The whole system depends on these records. Without them, there's chaos. There's no way to track who belongs where, who owes what." "Good," Isaiah said. He lunged forward and grabbed the satchel from her hands. Margaret screamed and tried to hold on, but his grip was iron itself, forged in literal fire over decades of labor that had destroyed lesser men. He wrenched the satchel away and strode back into the main foundry. Margaret followed, stumbling, her nightgown smoking from the embers. "No! No, you can't!" Isaiah opened the satchel and pulled out the ledgers. 3 heavy books bound in leather, their pages filled with her careful handwriting. Dates, names, prices. The complete inventory of human suffering that had built the Thornton fortune. He walked to the edge of the molten pit, the great crucible that fed the smaller molds, now glowing white-hot from the excessive fuel they'd fed it. Steam rose from its surface, carrying the acrid smell of superheated metal. "Don't," Margaret begged. "I'll give you anything. Money. Land. I'll free everyone. Write the papers myself." Isaiah held the first ledger over the pit. "You already took everything," he said. Then he dropped it. The book hit the molten iron and burst into flames before it even touched the surface. The pages curled and blackened, turning to ash in seconds. Every name, every transaction, every piece of evidence of ownership, consumed. Margaret fell to her knees, watching 3 years of work disappear. Isaiah dropped the second ledger, then the third, each one meeting the same fate. The flames consumed them eagerly, as if the fire itself was hungry for justice. "My fortune," Margaret whispered. "You've destroyed my fortune." "You destroyed yourself," Isaiah said. He looked down at her with something that might have been pity. "I just made it visible." Around them, the support beams began to groan. The excessive heat had weakened the foundry's structure, and now it was starting to fail. Workers were already fleeing toward the woods, carrying what supplies they could, disappearing into the darkness beyond the fire's reach. Isaiah walked past Margaret, stepping through pools of molten metal, as if they couldn't touch him. His feet left smoking prints on the wooden floor, but the flames seemed to part around him, recognizing one of their own. Behind him, Margaret remained on her knees, surrounded by the burning remains of her husband's empire. The furnace roared louder, building toward something catastrophic. The main crucible's walls were cracking, unable to contain the excessive heat. Isaiah reached the open doorway and paused, looking back one final time. Margaret met his eyes across the inferno, and in that moment they both understood what came next. The furnace exploded. The explosion shook the earth like a thunderclap. A column of fire punched through the foundry's roof, sending burning timbers spiraling into the night sky. The main crucible had failed catastrophically, spewing molten iron across the interior in waves of liquid death. Isaiah felt the blast wave hit him in the back as he cleared the doorway. The force threw him forward, his body tumbling across the hard-packed dirt. He rolled instinctively, covering his head as flaming debris rained down around him. Something hot struck his left shoulder, a piece of molten slag, and the pain was immediate and complete. He bit down hard to keep from screaming, tasting blood and ash. Behind him, the foundry collapsed inward. The walls buckled and fell, the roof caving in with a sound like the end of the world. Whatever remained of Margaret Thornton disappeared beneath tons of burning wreckage and superheated metal. The screaming stopped. The pleading stopped. Everything stopped, except the roar of the flames. Isaiah pushed himself to his knees, then to his feet. The burn on his shoulder throbbed with every heartbeat, but he was alive. Around him, scattered across the plantation grounds, the other workers were already vanishing into the tree line. Some carried bundles of food stolen from the kitchens. Others had weapons, tools from the forge, axes from the woodshed. They moved like shadows, silent and determined, disappearing into the forest's embrace. Jacob appeared at Isaiah's side, his branded shoulder still bandaged. "Can you walk?" Isaiah nodded, though his legs felt unsteady. Together they staggered away from the inferno, following the others toward the woods. Behind them, the Thornton ironworks burned so hot that the very ground seemed to liquefy, the sand in the soil turning to glass beneath the heat. They walked through the night, guided by stars and fear. Every sound made them freeze: a snapping branch, an owl's cry, the distant baying of hounds that might or might not be real. But no pursuit came. The plantation was in chaos, the overseer dead, the mistress gone, the main house staff too terrified to organize a search party before dawn. By the time the sky began to lighten, they'd traveled several miles deep into the forest. Other groups of escapees had scattered in different directions, making tracking difficult. Isaiah's group numbered 7. Jacob, 2 brothers named Samuel and Thomas, an older woman called Aunt Bess, a young girl no more than 12, and Isaiah himself. They found a ravine thick with undergrowth and huddled there as the sun rose. No one spoke. They were too exhausted, too overwhelmed by what they'd done and what it meant. Isaiah sat with his back against a tree, the burn on his shoulder seeping fluid through his torn shirt. He stared at his hands, scarred, blackened with soot, trembling slightly from adrenaline and pain. These were the hands that had killed Silas Thornton, the hands that had burned Margaret's fortune to ash, the hands that had helped destroy the only life he'd ever known. He closed them into fists and felt the familiar calluses, the permanent marks of decades at the forge. Whatever else changed, those would remain. Evidence of what he'd been, what he'd survived, what he'd become. "Papa?" Isaiah's head snapped up. The voice came from beyond the ravine, weak but unmistakable. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the protest from his injured shoulder, and pushed through the undergrowth. Caleb stood at the edge of a stream, leaning heavily against a tree. His clothes were torn and bloodied. His left leg was wrapped in makeshift bandages that looked days old. But he was alive. He was standing. He was here. Isaiah ran. He couldn't remember the last time he'd run anywhere. But now his legs carried him forward without thought. He crashed into his son, wrapping his arms around him, and felt Caleb's weight sag against him. They stood there in the growing dawn light, neither speaking, both shaking with relief and exhaustion, and something too large for words. "I heard," Caleb finally whispered. "Heard about the foundry. Heard what you did." Isaiah pulled back to look at his son's face. "How did you escape?" "The convoy stopped in Petersburg for the night. Guard got drunk. I slipped my chains and ran." Caleb's eyes were hollow with things he'd seen, things Isaiah didn't want to imagine. "Been walking 3 days. Followed the smoke when I saw it." Isaiah touched his son's face, checking for serious injuries. Besides the leg wound and various cuts and bruises, Caleb seemed intact, alive, free. "Can you walk?" Isaiah asked. "If I have to." "We have to." They returned to the ravine where the others waited. Aunt Bess tended to Caleb's leg with strips torn from her own dress, wrapping the wound properly. The brothers shared what little food they'd managed to carry, cornmeal and dried meat. The young girl sat close to Caleb, staring at him like he'd returned from the dead. When the sun climbed higher, they began walking again. North. Always north. Isaiah led them through the forest, following the path of the river when they could, cutting through dense undergrowth when they had to. Every mile took them farther from the plantation, from the burning foundry, from everything they'd known. By midday, they were exhausted. They found a cave hidden behind a waterfall and collapsed inside, taking turns keeping watch. Isaiah sat at the cave's entrance, looking out at the forest, and felt time stretch strange around him. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.